Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. Appreciate you making time. We know it's a very busy time for everyone. So this is a briefing, as you know, on the USPTO Drug Patent and Exclusivity Report. We're C4IP, the Council for Innovation Promotion. We're happy to host today's event. I want to first recognize Senator Tillis's office for making today's room available. Appreciate all the great work that they are doing on these important issues. And also want to thank all the congressional staff who are in attendance. We know how busy it is this week and the next couple of weeks, so making time for today's briefing is deeply appreciated. Just very briefly about the Council for Innovation Promotion. We're a bipartisan, nonpartisan group. We're dedicated to promoting and supporting the intellectual property policies that we believe drive innovation, create jobs, increase American competitiveness, and of course, improve lives everywhere. I think many of you know the important role that intellectual property plays, but unfortunately, over the last few decades, there has been a concentrated effort by some folks who actually don't have either a business model that utilizes IP or a philosophical belief in things like property rights to undermine the intellectual property rights that have really separated America from the rest of the world, made us the most creative and most innovative country in the world with the strongest economy. I think many of you can agree that having the ability to compete with countries that want to supplant us as the world's leading economy remains tremendously important. So today's briefing talks a bit about an issue that unfortunately has really changed over the last several years, and that's the appreciation of the role that patents play in terms of driving innovation. We're here today again to talk about the USPTO study that was prompted by a letter sent by Senator Tom Tillis in January of 2022. It was actually created, this study, in conjunction with the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, and provides a baseline approach that researchers and policymakers can use in future analysis for examining the number of years from the time a new drug application, or NDA, is first approved until the first launch of a generic. Now, we all know that there's a legitimate conversation to be had around drug pricing and the role of patents. But unfortunately, in recent years, some folks have weaponized IP to try to use it in a distorted and misguided way to apply it to things like lowering drug prices. In fact, patents play a minuscule role in the price of any drug. And according to the PTO, the study illustrates that simply quantifying the raw numbers of patents and exclusivities is an imprecise way to measure the intellectual property landscape of a drug product, because not every patent or exclusivity has the same scope. But as I said, unfortunately, there have been many mischaracterizations and inaccurate data cited in relation to the role patents play in the biopharma sector and how that may impact prescription drug prices and the entry of generic alternatives into the marketplace. But unfortunately, those narratives have taken root based on very little information that's factual. There's little evidence to support many of the misleading narratives and pejorative terms about the role of patents in relation to drug pricing or generic entry. In fact, the United States has the highest percentage of generics among advanced economies, approximately 92%. So good public policy and legislative proposals should be based on sound data and facts. And today our panel will share information that we hope you will consider as you continue to work on these important issues. I'm honored to be joined by a group of expert policy folks who can share their perspectives on these important issues. First, my colleague Jamie Simpson, who's Chief Policy Officer and Counsel for the Council for Innovation Promotion. Also joined by Professor Emily Michiko-Morris, the Associate Director of the Center for IP Law and Technology at the University of Akron School of Law, and Mr. Corey Salzberg, who is Vice President and Global Head of IP Affairs at Novartis. And before I introduce them, I just want to say one more thing about Congress's focus on these issues. In recent years, much of the attention around IP policy has been devoted to patent policy. It's tremendously important that we get it right. For America to remain competitive, we cannot abandon what has really put us in the leadership position in terms of innovation and also creative output as a result of the strong IP policies we enjoy here in the United States. We are chaired by two former USPTO directors, one appointed by President Obama and one by the previous administration. And we have two retired federal judges from the Federal Circuit where IP cases are heard. Our leadership understands better than most the real world implications of weakening our IP system. And we simply cannot allow that to happen if we're going to maintain our leadership and competitiveness. Some of the important things in the study we're very pleased to see. But some of the things that we need to talk about today were not included in the study. And there's a lot more information and a lot more context to this entire issue. And hopefully this panel can help shed some more light on not only the importance of what is in the study, but some of the issues and some of the other facts that you may not be aware of. So with that, I'm turning to my colleague, Jamie, for her presentation. Jamie?
Thanks again, Frank. So I actually did want to start with that letter to provide some background on why we're all here today. So that's one of the two handouts you might have picked up on your way in here. So in January of 2022, Senator Tillis wrote a letter where he expressed concern that he was seeing a lot of the policy focused around drug pricing on the Hill be focused on patents in a way that he thought was based on misleading or inaccurate data. And one of the things he wrote in the letter, which I thought was noteworthy, on the second page, he wrote that it appears that many of the drugs alleged to be protected by quote unquote patent thickets blocking competition for decades to come have already gone generic, in some cases before the reports making these allegations were even published. So based on seeing some of this misleading data, he asked the FDA and the PTO to conduct their own independent assessment of the drugs whose patents were featured in these reports. So fast forward to about 2.5 years later, the PTO did release a report over this past summer that looked at some of the drugs that Senator Tillis flagged and issued a very thorough, comprehensive report that looked at the patents and, in consultation with the FDA, provided data about FDA approval and generic approval if there was a generic in the market at the time. So the part of the point of the briefing is that if you've seen this report, it's 108 pages, it's very dense. So we wanted to kind of highlight what we think are some of the key takeaways and also flag some of what we think is the key data from the report. You can go back and obviously look at any of it if you want more details. But to start to elaborate on something that Frank mentioned, we think this report is a great start for providing a baseline for policymakers to consult when they're considering patents and drug pricing issues, but it doesn't cover the whole landscape. And one of the limitations I just wanted to explain up front is that the report focuses on one class of drugs that are referred to as small molecule drugs. It doesn't analyze biologic drugs. And I'm going to explain the difference between those at an extremely high level just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So small molecule drugs are drugs that, compared to biologics, are relatively chemically simple, and they're drugs like aspirin, or one of the drugs in the report is Ambien. Those are small molecule drugs. And they're governed for purposes of patents by a law called the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984, and that governs when generics can come onto the market if there are patents involved. So you might have heard of something called the Orange Book, which we're going to talk a bit more about. And for Hatch-Waxman and small molecule drugs, the relevant patents are listed in the Orange Book. So the other class of drugs is biologics. So these are a lot more complicated most of the time, and kind of a classic example is genetically engineered version of a naturally occurring protein, something like an antibody. A couple you might have heard of are Humira and Enbrel. So that's another class of drugs, and the report does not get into those. And I think this is a preview of some of what Emily is going to talk more about, but other areas where we think more research and more data is going to be helpful. But turning back to the report, it does actually make a number of important points with respect to the drugs that it examined. So I'm turning to the first page of the other handout. We've taken a couple of quotations from different parts of the drug exclusivity report just to highlight some of the findings that the PTO made. The first one of the key findings, is that simple counts of patents don't necessarily indicate anything about the length of exclusivity a drug is going to have before a generic enters the market. So on the Hill, we hear a lot about patent thickets, looking just at numbers of drugs. And this report suggests that just looking at those numbers is not really a good way to assess the amount of exclusivity. The second point it makes is that follow-on patents don't necessarily affect the ability of a generic to enter the market. So another thing that we've heard a lot about on the Hill is this concept of evergreening, or the idea that a follow-on invention after the core invention surrounding a drug will further block generic competition. And as this report shows, later patents don't, in most cases, block the earlier generics. Third point they make is that when you're looking at total counts, even though those are not necessarily the right indicator, you should not at all include pending or abandoned applications. Those aren't issued patents. They don't confer any exclusive rights. Finally, the report makes the point that most innovative products in the marketplace are covered by numerous patents. This is not something that's unique to the pharmaceutical industry, but it's something you see across the board for products like smartphones or golf balls or many other things have a lot of patents involved. So turning to some of the data in the report, I'm looking now at page 2, where we've taken what the report does when it looks at 13 drugs that had generics come into the market during the study period of the report. So the report looked at a total of 25 different new drug applications. 13 of those had generics come on the market. So if you look at those 13, you can see how much time the originator company had for its product on the market where it enjoyed market exclusivity. You can compare that to the number of patents that company had listed in the Orange Book that I mentioned before. And you can see that there's not any sort of easy correlation between that number of patents and when a generic entered the market. And another thing that I think is worth noting is that if you look at the years of total exclusivity, which is the last column, none of those are 20 years, which is the length of time you get for a full issued patent. So none of these drugs even got a full 20 years of exclusivity on the market. And one other thing I wanted to highlight, which is reflected in a footnote, is that the PTO noted that what it did here is not statistically significant, although its average exclusivity was about 11.4 years. But if you look at this 11.4 years, it's in line with what other research has found that has looked at a lot more data. And those other references are in the footnote, and one of them actually collects a lot of other studies if you want to take a look. So turning to the next page, here we wanted to compare what the USPTO found with what one of the other groups that Senator Tillis flagged had reported in its reports that were circulated on the Hill. So this compares some of the drugs the PTO looked at with some of the drugs that this other entity called IMAC looked at. And here you can see a number of important things. First is that if you look at the Orange Book listed patents, it differs pretty dramatically from the number of patents that IMAC listed as covering each patent. And this is important because only the Orange Book listed patents can block FDA approval of a generic. So these really high numbers that IMAC is showing really kind of overstate the degree to which there are any patent barriers to entry. And in addition to that, they also include abandoned patent applications and pending applications, neither of which confer any exclusive rights, so arguably shouldn't be included in the total counts at all. The other important point is that for the drugs where a generic did enter the market during this time, you can see that the actual generic entry occurred much sooner than the IMAC data would suggest. And to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, I want to look at the first drug that's listed in this chart, which is Lyrica. And the PTO report breaks Lyrica down into 3 different products. So these are 3 different products for which there was a separate FDA approval that needed to be sought, and they each have a separate FDA approval date. They each have their own Orange Book listing of patents, and IMAC lumped all of these together. And the result of that is, as you can see here, the actual number of patents listed in the Orange Book is different for the different drugs, and the actual length of time before a generic entered the market is also different. So kind of conflating all of these together is another way that this data is misleading. And finally, just turning to the last page, to put this in further context, we wanted to pull in some data from another source. This other source is the Intellectual Property Owners Association, and every year they publish a list of the top patent recipients from the USPTO. So last year's list of 300, it was actually 301 last year. On that entire list, there were only 6 biopharma companies. And the list was actually dominated by companies from the tech sector, who had about 100 entities on this list. And another point, just to flag to kind of put this in context, is that the top patent recipient, which last year was Samsung Electronics, got over 3 times the number of patents as all of the listed pharmaceutical companies combined. So this kind of reflects something I said earlier, which is it's common for many products to have multiple patents covering them. And getting patents is something that innovative companies across the board do. And going back to something that Frank said earlier, it also just reflects the fact that any change to the patent system done for the purpose of drugs is going to affect all of these other companies who also rely on patents to encourage and protect their innovation. And so with that, I've gone through what I wanted to talk about. And
well, thank you, Jamie. Professor Morris.
So I just wanted to reiterate some of what Jamie said, but also to say that there actually is data out there, and it's kind of unfortunate that Senator Tillis had to ask the USPTO to do this study. And again, it's, as Jamie said, it's a relatively small study. It's hard to claim that it's statistically significant because there are a number of academic studies out there that are statistically significant that do look at large numbers of drugs in a rigorous fashion. And for the most part, they show that the PTO got it right. That the data and the conclusions that the PTO drew from their analyses are in fact correct. So I think that the important point here, and a couple different important take-home points that I hope you take with you from this particular briefing, is that there are a lot of criticisms of the pharmaceutical industry and how they use patents. A lot of these criticisms collect a variety of kind of fairly random data. So as Jamie said, a lot of these criticisms just look at numbers of patents and look at numbers of years that those patents represent. But there's no data that I have seen, at least supporting these criticisms, that actually look at the effect of these patents on whether or not generic drugs or biosimilars are able to enter the market. And that the studies that are out there all tend to prove that the number of drugs or the number of patents on a given drug do not have an effect on when generics enter the market or when biosimilars enter the market. So there are a number of studies that Jamie referred to that say, hey, look, for the last 30 plus years, the time between when a brand name drug enters the market and when a generic version of that drug enters the market has not really changed. And if anything, it's decreased over time. So it's in my research, it's about 13 years, somewhere between 11 and 13 years, and it's decreasing, if anything. And you don't have to take my word for it. Some of the critics themselves have done their own analyses and shown that what we call effective patent life, or what some economists call market exclusivity period, that has stayed the same for the last 30 plus years, or even shrunk over time. And the PTO's data reflect this. So this idea that somehow patents are evergreening exclusivity over drugs, evergreening monopolies over drugs, that's been disproven a number of times. And that's a fairly old claim. A newer claim, I think probably in response to the fact that effective patent life, the effective exclusivity that brand names have over their drugs, has not changed and has in fact probably gone down, is this idea that they're somehow creating these patent thickets over their drugs. And by patent thicket, typically outside of the pharmaceutical industry, we mean that there are a large number of drugs. And even if those drugs don't necessarily provide longer protection, simply by the sheer number of those patents, it takes a while to litigate through those patents and just to clear through them in order for a generic or a biosimilar to enter the market. And I think that the PTO study does a nice job of looking at this as well. My own research has looked at this as well. And it's shown that there's zero correlation between the number of patents that are on a particular drug and when a generic version of that drug can enter the market. So my own research, I've looked at drugs that were the best sellers in 2011. I think there were over 113 or 131 drugs that we looked at. So a statistically significant sample size. And again, we showed that there's no correlation between the number of patents on a drug and when a generic version can enter the market. And that's to like a 99.999% confidence interval. So there's really no question there with that particular sample size that there's any correlation between number of patents and generic drug entry. And that this is using a database put together by, again, critics of the pharmaceutical industry who looked at the number of patents and who looked at the number of years that those patents represent, but failed to take that final step and look at whether or not there was any correlation between those patents and when generics actually enter the market. And this is a fairly common pattern that we see. And as Jamie mentioned, some of these studies, some of these data aggregations are kind of meaningless because not only do they look just at the number of patents and just at the number of years, but in many cases, as Jamie mentioned, they also count patents that never even existed. So you have to question whether or not these represent real numbers. And in fact, you look at these patents and you look at what's actually going on with these patents. And it's pretty clear why sheer numbers of patents and sheer number of patent protection years really has no correlation with generic market entry. And that's because the patent holders, right, the brand name pharmaceutical companies, are using the patents the way they're supposed to be used. So in our study, for example, almost 50% of the drugs for which we were able to identify this data, and I think it was like 87 drugs, almost 20% did not have to challenge any patents at all. There were no patents standing between the generic and FDA approval and market entry. And then for another 30%, there were some patents, but in many of those cases, the patent holders did not assert those patents against the generics, presumably because everybody acknowledged that those patents were not being infringed. And so this idea that the patents are somehow being abused, right? That they're somehow being obtained sheerly for the purpose of deterring generic or biosimilar entry really is not supported by the data. And I'll just throw this out there, and please feel free to ask me questions about this afterward. I don't want to take too much time. But there's actually data showing, and there's plenty of reason to believe, that the pharmaceutical industry actually doesn't enjoy enough patent protection. And this is for a number of different reasons. First of all, the industry is the one industry, it's the one technology where we're fairly certain that the patent system does what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to incentivize invention and supposed to incentivize investment in bringing those inventions to the public. And of course, we know in the pharmaceutical industry, they have a particularly high regulatory burden because they have to prove that their drugs are safe and effective. This is costly, and this is why the patents are so important to them. But there's been at least one study that I know of, perhaps more. It's a somewhat disputed study, but the study suggests that at least for truly new drugs, right, that it requires 16 years of exclusivity for the manufacturers of that new drug to recoup their research and development investments, not necessarily to make a profit, just to recoup their investment. And again, if you remember, the mean exclusivity period for most of these drugs is only about somewhere between 11 and 13 years. So they're falling short of the period of exclusivity that they need truly to recoup the research and development dollars, right? And so if you want companies to continue investing in the development of truly new drugs, it's perhaps worthwhile wondering whether or not they're actually getting enough patent protection. And the same is true for drugs that are already existing. We know that drugs work within a biological system. Biological systems are very complex. And so a drug is never going to have a single effect. It's always going to have side effects, right? But it's also going to have effects on things that we didn't even realize it could have positive effects on treatments and conditions and indications for which we didn't even know that that drug might be useful. So obviously we want to have further research into all the different uses for which these drugs can be leveraged. But if there's not adequate patent protection, they're not going to have incentives to invest in this kind of additional research, right? This kind of sequential research that's often criticized, but is often incredibly valuable and brings a whole lot of social welfare. And then just the one last point I'll throw out there, and I've done research on this before. As Frank mentioned, we talk a lot about patents. Patents are just one type of intellectual property. It's arguably the most important for the pharmaceutical industry and just about every other technology. But the pharmaceutical patents are subject to a number of different pharmaceutical-specific statutory regimes. Jamie mentioned one of those, which is the Hatch-Waxman Act, but there are an increasing number of others. And they all tend to limit the efficacy of patent protections. They all tend to limit the scope and the strength of pharmaceutical patents, obviously because we want to make pharmaceuticals as accessible to the public as possible. But it's not just patents. It's actually trademarks, even copyright, trade secrecy. They're all limited in the pharmaceutical industry, which is somewhat ironic when you consider that the pharmaceutical industry is the one industry that we think benefits the most from these kinds of intellectual property protections. And so this is a story that I don't hear very often, mostly because one side of the debate focuses almost solely on access to medications, access to pharmaceuticals, without thinking about everything that needs to come before that, right? And so it's quite possible that if we are overly aggressive in trying to regulate pharmaceutical patents, and again, we're already very aggressive with that, if we are overly aggressive with it, we could be, shooting the goose that lays the golden egg. And so it's something to think about. And I'll just end there.
Thanks, Emily. Frank?
No, go ahead, Corey. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, no, that is a great place to hand over, because I want to spend a few minutes talking about the real world implications of the PTO study on the pharmaceutical industry and what we do to develop drugs and get them to patients. And I thought, what better way to start a conversation about the real world than to quote a fictional character from a 135-year-old book about time travel. And that is Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. In this book, you may know it, the protagonist goes back in time. He gets himself to get in charge of the Kingdom of Camelot, so he's making the decisions. And here's a famous quote that you might have heard. He says, "The very first official thing I did in my administration was to start a patent office, for I knew that a country without a patent office and good patent laws was just a crab and couldn't travel any way but sideways or backwards." Now, I love this quote because despite being based in a work of fiction, it's of course capturing the essence of the real patent system, which is all about promoting progress. And when Mark Twain wrote this, he knew that America's founders had thought exactly the same thing and done exactly the same thing. America's founders enshrined the patent system, as many of you may know, in the Constitution as the only right given to individuals before we even get to the Bill of Rights. It's the only one of its kind in what would become known as the Progress Clause. And while the Patent Act of 1790 wasn't the very first thing that the first Congress did, it was actually the third. Since then, and this is the important part, the system has become America's innovation engine. As I think you all know, it was and continues to be really the central enabler of many of America's core industries, its core technologies, and the core innovative products that come out of it. And that goes for biopharmaceuticals as well, where you would be hard-pressed to find a single medicine in existence that doesn't owe that existence to the patents behind it. So what does that have to do with the USPTO study? I think a lot, actually, because from a real-world perspective, the PTO study, I would say, has two main takeaways. So the first, for me, is that we have been having the wrong conversation in the United States about patents. When we focus, as you've heard, on how many patents cover medicine and when the very last one of those patents expire, we, number one, don't get useful information about competition. We've just heard that. The PTO study proves that. But we do miss crucial information about innovation when we're simply counting up patents and not thinking about what they do. We should be asking what the patents on a particular medicine actually reflect and how they actually impact, not just these ideas that more patents must equal block competition. We need to look at how they actually impact not just competition, but how they actually impact innovation as well. And if we're not asking those questions, we're really missing the forest for the trees, and we do risk advancing policies that undermine the future of medicine, and yes, that risk turning America into a crap. Second takeaway for me, I think this is really important, and I don't think we've hit it enough yet. Even with respect to those wrong questions that have been asked, we have been getting the wrong answers. And that is really something that the PTO study also confirms. As we've already heard today, the data on patent numbers and patent term that we've been relying on simply isn't accurate. Now, I want to quote someone else. I want to quote John Arnold. John Arnold is the man who founded an LLC called Arnold Ventures that funds IMAC and most of the other studies that we've been relying upon in our policymaking. And this is an article, an interview with him from 2017 in Wired magazine. He said, "A new study shows are the four most dangerous words in the English language." And he further goes on to say, "Unless you can trust a researcher's work, you can't believe the findings of any study until you carefully vet it." Well, in this respect, we couldn't agree more with Mr. Arnold. And now we have vetted data from a very reliable source, which is the USPTO. So it's time that we start using it and start adjusting our policies accordingly. So let me, with those two kind of main points, elaborate a little more on some of the key findings that I think are key from the study and how they really impact in the real world our industry. So the study makes three main practical findings, I'd say. Number one, you've heard this a couple times before today, simply counting up patents doesn't tell you if or how those patents are going to affect generic entry. Number two, higher patent counts do not generally correlate with later generic entry. Emily just did a great job of explaining that. But if you look at even the study itself, there's 25 products in here. Some of the drugs with the longest exclusivity periods in this study actually have one or two patents associated with them. And some of them with the shortest exclusivity periods have something like 5 or more patents on them. Third point, and this is what I really want to hit here, is that there is a correlation between having multiple patents and higher levels of complexity of the innovation that goes into a product. And the study concludes, as you've also heard, that this is very common across industries. And this is where I really want to spend the rest of my time, because it's almost always overlooked in patent policy discussions, the impact that more patents actually have positively on innovation. I like to think of this as, I call this kind of talk that I sometimes give, your tablet is a tablet, and here's why. If you think about the kind of tablet like an iPad, right, the smart tablet, most people understand that that's the kind of device. It's very complicated and has lots of inventions inside that have come together into a single invention. By some estimates, there's as many as 250,000 patented components in a smartphone or a smart tablet. But for some reason, when people think of the kind of tablet that we take when we're sick, they think it's only one invention and there should only be one patent on it. But we know from experience, and the PTO study confirms this as well, that that's simply not the case. So when we develop a medicine, there's usually a 10 to 15 year development timeline. About 88% of all of the candidates that we test in the clinic end up failing. And the few that succeed, here's the important point, they usually do so because of all of the ongoing innovation that happens during that 10 to 15 year development phase. So this includes the invention of novel formulations, novel indications, novel routes of administration. So that's how we get the drug into the body. Novel dosing, because if you dose it too high, there could be bad side effects. If you dose it too low, it's not effective enough. All of these are separate inventions. And it turns out that the more complex the drug is, it usually requires more innovation to actually make it one of those 12% of drugs that will succeed. And even with all of this innovation that goes into things that can actually heal and cure and treat disease in the body, the average number of patents, as you've heard in the PTO study, comes out to about 8.6. 8.6 of the 25 drugs that were selected for this study. But if you broaden this out and take a step back, as Emily mentioned, the other studies that have looked consistently at all of the Orange Book listed drugs find the average to be between 3 and 5 patents per drug. That's what we're really talking about here. To put that in perspective, I think Jamie mentioned this, some golf balls have 70 patents on them, and medicines have between 3 and 5 on average. Why does this matter? Well, because the 20-year, remember there's a 20-year patent term per patent, right? But if we have a 10 to 15-year development timeline, the earliest patents that we file, which are usually the core ones on our compounds, have almost expired, or in some cases have expired by the time we're ready to actually launch our medicine. So in the real world, without those patents on all the additional inventions that happen between the time you invent a compound and the time you launch, you would never end up developing and launching most medicines if you didn't have the ability to continue patenting all these additional things that go into it. Second key set of findings relates to continuing innovation. I think the other speakers talked about this as well. The PTO study uses that term to refer to inventions made after the initial product is launched. In short, the PTO study correctly explains that while patents may issue to changes that you make to a drug or to new versions of a drug or to new uses of that drug, those later patents do not, they don't extend the earlier patents, as we often hear from critics. They don't cover, in most cases, the original versions, and they certainly do not block generics of the original versions once those original patents expire. And the study also, again, correctly notes that this is a common practice across really all industries to use the patent system to help enable the later innovation that happens after you've launched version 1.0. If you want to get to version 2.0, you need an incentive to do that. We can call this part, as I said before, your tablet is a tablet. I like to call this your tablet is a wheel. You think about the wheel, the world's most famous and supposedly the oldest invention from caveman times. How many times has that been improved? We still see new wheels used in all kinds of ways today. Same thing happens with our medicines. We launch a medicine, we don't stop innovating. We want to find ways to make it safer, more effective, more efficient, more convenient for the patient, and even ways to make it better or make it useful for a different disease for the first time. Let me give you some quick real-world examples of that. Outside of our company, one of the most famous ones, the first HIV treatments, antiretrovirals, those started their lives as cancer treatments that had failed and sat in the shelves, and we revisited them decades later, and it turned out they were effective for HIV. Aspirin is 100 years old, and yet we continue to find new medical applications for that. From our own portfolio, I can give you an example of an Alzheimer's drug we had called Exelon that was an oral form, and we actually kept innovating and turned it into a patch form. Why does that matter? Well, an Alzheimer's patient often forgets to take their medicine. So if you can turn it into a patch, you solve that problem. And it turns out that new formulation in a patch also eliminated one of the bad side effects, which was a gastric side effect from taking the oral version. So why does this matter? Because continuing innovation, of course, as I just explained, leads to actual new treatments for patients. And it can't and won't happen if you don't have those later patents to incentivize that further work. And I want to end with one last point. I want to return back to the importance of data integrity and the importance of not relying on sources that have been proven unreliable. Again, as John Arnold himself has said, it's important to make sure we follow the data and be data-driven and not just follow sources that haven't done that. The PTO study, as you've heard today and as you see in your handouts, it unequivocally debunks claims by IMAC and others that patented medicines block competition, generic competition for 30 to 50 years, which I think is the figure they keep putting out in their reports. The drugs in the PTO study, the 25 that they looked at, had a range of exclusivity of between 3 and 16 years, and the average, as Jamie said, I think is about 11.3, 11.4. That's right in line with multiple studies of the whole Orange Book, which show the average to be, I think, around 12 to 14 years. If you actually look at the more expensive drugs, the highest grossing drugs, the top selling drugs, I think the number drops to about 10 to 13 years. That makes sense because there's more incentive for generics, of course, to go after those drugs. And for context, this is a really important point. This is well below the 20 years that the patent system, both in the US and globally, is supposed to give for innovations, right? We have 20-year patent terms and we're getting between 12 and 14 on average. It's even below the minimum 14 years that our patent term extension system at a minimum is supposed to give to drugs, and we're not even getting that. So this matters, of course, because the false narrative that patents are enjoying these unduly long exclusivity periods, unfortunately, have been driving policy discussions and even being cited in proposed legislation in this country as reasons to limit or to eliminate patents. Just one more quick example, and then I'll stop. Just to give a sense of how bad the data is, a 2017 IMAC report claimed that one of our drugs, a cancer drug called Gleevec, had 35 years of exclusivity and would not allow generic competition until 2029. Generics, in that case, had already launched 2 years before IMAC ever published its report. It had a total market exclusivity of 15 years. And that same report, by the way, claimed that Gleevec was covered by 73 patents. The real number was 5. So as I said, it's really time to stop citing and relying on sources like that keep being shown to be so unreliable. And now that we actually have this reliable data and methodology from the PTO, I really think it's time to adjust our policy making accordingly, because if we start cutting our overall market exclusivity or our ability to get patents on these really important later inventions, we're simply not going to have many more medicines in the future to be talking about.
Thanks, Corey. One thing I think is interesting here is that the data and the fact-based approach to policy is something I think most people on the Hill actually prefer. But for some reason, we've seen this false narrative and also sort of a demonization of one industry sector take root. And that might be because there is a laudable and actually reasonable conversation to have about other aspects of policy. I would like to turn back to something that Professor Morris said, and perhaps the panel can expand on this. While I ask the professor first. What's wrong with holding the pharmaceutical sector to a different standard? And also, we already know they have to go through a lot of hoops when it comes to not just the patent process, but also FDA approval and other types of regulatory processes. But from your standpoint, is there anything wrong with having kind of a discriminatory patent system where we hold one particular sector more responsible than others?
So I don't know that treating the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical technologies a little bit differently is necessarily a bad thing, in part because we do know that it's the one industry and one area of technology in which the patent system really works. We do know that it is the industry with the heaviest regulatory burdens and therefore the highest research and development costs. All of which is to say, if you're going to treat it a little bit differently than other technologies, you shouldn't be discriminating against it, right? You ought to be supporting it. And so Corey referenced very briefly the patent term extension provisions we have in the Hatch-Waxman Act, which, again, as Jamie mentioned, addresses small molecule drugs. And that was partly because we recognized that the small molecule drugs weren't enjoying enough patent protections. That in part because they have such long development cycles and such high regulatory burdens, they needed to have at least one patent extended, and that's what the Hatch-Waxman Act provides. And I think that's something that's very much overlooked by some of the critics who characterize the Hatch-Waxman Act as solely trying to rein in pharmaceutical patents, which is not true. There are a number of provisions that actually try to bolster patent protections for pharmaceuticals within that act, as well as in some of the other legislation that we've seen since then that are all pharmaceutical specific. But I think exactly as Corey said, if you want the pharmaceutical industry to continue to be strong, as strong as it is in the United States, and perhaps more importantly, to be continue to be as productive as it is, and to create as much social welfare as it does, I think you need to realize that it does need, in fact, protection. It does not, in fact, need the kind of incentives that allow it to continue to invest in itself.
Can I just make a quick point about that? Yeah. So the data overall in the industry shows that only about 20 to 30% of drugs actually make a profit at all. I know that may be hard to believe because we often hear about the drugs that are high priced, but it's just like any other industry. I mean, you take blockbuster films, right? I mean, some of them make hundreds of millions of dollars in profit, and some of them barely make a profit or don't make a profit at all. Same thing happens in our industry like many others. So that figure is about 20 to 30%. And the other really important piece of that on the economics is that most of the money on a drug is actually made on the later years. And that makes sense because when you launch a new drug, you're talking about human health and you're talking about treating patients. And doctors, I think rightly, are slow to, unless it's a disease that has no current standard of care, doctors are slow to start to prescribe the drug. And it takes time to actually convince them, number one, to use it, but from their own experience to actually penetrate the market from a business perspective, but to start treating patients. So it's often the case that it's those later years that actually get you to that 20 to 30% of drugs that make a profit. And if you were to cut the term further, you'd have fewer and fewer drugs that would make a profit at all. And of course, that makes it much more difficult to continue investing in R&D.
So what is the real risk if we have changes to patent policy? I mean, we hear all the time that China, for instance, is looking to become a leader in different areas, whether it's technology or biopharma, other areas. And we've seen how the United States has really become the world's leader in terms of innovation in the biopharma space, following Europe's change in many policy aspects of how they actually manage things. So is there a risk if we change patent policy to our ability to remain the innovative leader and also to maintain our competitiveness globally? Maybe I'll start with Jamie.
Thanks. Well, I think it's really interesting, kind of following on that question, that in many ways, China effectively copied the U.S. patent system in an effort to become, in its view, it wants to become the global innovation leader. So that really calls into question what we're doing if we take steps to weaken our own patent system. So I think kind of bearing that in mind, kind of circling back to what I said earlier, if you're just looking at the patent system in the context of pharmaceutical drugs, and I think there are a lot of reasons to proceed more cautiously that we've kind of outlined here today, you're also having an impact on all of our other industries that rely on these patents. And another thing I think is particularly important to keep in mind is that patents are critical to small companies, especially when we're talking about drug pricing. I think it's easy to think of big companies, and even they, I think, would rather spend money on R&D than on regulation and patents. But they are bigger companies. But innovation in the pharmaceutical and the biotechnology space happens across the board. And small companies, especially if they can't make a profit for about 20 years, really rely on patent protection. So if we weaken patents, we're really hurting ourselves, and not only our ability to have innovations that will help ourselves, but will help maintain our competitiveness internationally.
I can give a real world, company perspective on that. I mean, there's a reason why our research is based in the United States and our development in the United States, in Switzerland, in Europe, and increasingly in places like China. And that's because all of these countries are the ones that have strengthened and have traditionally strong IP systems. There's a reason on the flip side why we're not doing our major R&D in India, for example, right? And then the other reason, of course, why you want to have strong patent protection as a country is not only to have the innovation happen in your borders, but you also want it to be a place where companies want to launch their products. And we find a direct correlation between strong patent system and the drugs that get launched, where they get launched first. So in Germany, for example, and the United States and Japan and China, these are places where we are launching our drugs first and where you can find a broader availability of drugs than you can in countries that have weak patent systems.
Thanks, Corey. Professor?
Yeah, so I was just going to add that there is data showing a strong correlation between returns on investment and further investment, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, and that without these patent protections, we see a decrease in future research and development. So a lot of the critics try to say, well, the patent system isn't to reward you for the expenses that you've already invested in creating a new drug and achieving regulatory approval of it. But they're missing the point that the returns today that we receive on a patent are what incentivize the investments in the future, right? And so if you see a reduction in patent protections, you're going to see a reduction in investment and research and development. And I think another point that a lot of people miss or kind of flip on its head is exactly what Jamie said. That especially in the modern day pharmaceutical industry, we see a pattern now more and more of proofs of concept being developed by some smaller companies and then being acquired by the larger companies who actually have to go through all the rigor that Corey described of actually proving that it's safe and effective enough to be approved for use in patients. And so if you don't have patent protections, even for those small companies who are still working on the proof of concept stage, they won't be able to basically transfer that proof of concept to the larger companies, and those drugs will never be developed. And so you really need patent protections from the beginning through the end. And just because these concepts are being developed by smaller companies doesn't mean that the larger companies don't also need patent protections for exactly all those stages of development that Corey talked about.
Thank you, Professor. I'd also mention that many of our research universities actually bring some of the foundational discoveries into fruition and actually have an opportunity to bring them to market. But they also enjoy patent protection, which helps enable those products to go from the foundational research actually into the marketplace eventually. We only have a few moments left. We have a lot more questions I could ask. I'd like to open it up, though, to the audience. Certainly welcome any questions, particularly from congressional staff. But we appreciate you being here. There's an awful lot to unpack. But I think one of the most important things to take away here is that let's make sure that when we're looking at policy, we're actually looking at what the real data shows us and actually what the real world implications would be for any major shifts in policy. We didn't get here by accident. The genius of our founders helped us become the leading economy in the world. So with that, I'd love to hear any questions from the audience, and also thank you all for being here. Manis.
Okay, sorry, Manis Cooney. We heard a lot about the effects of policy changes on the drug industry, treatments. Devil's advocate here, say I just don't care about the drug industry right now. Are there implications beyond the pharmaceutical industry, biotech industry, or what Congress may be contemplating and proposing with respect to some of the reforms that are aimed at getting drug prices under control?
Yeah, so I'll step in, and some of you may have heard about the current proposals to start exercising margin rights under the Bayh-Dole Act that Frank kind of alluded to just now, in which those who receive federal government funding for research, basic research, can patent that research so that it can be transferred to others who might develop it into commercializable applications. And the most frustrating thing about this proposal is that this proposal is literally put forth as a means to control drug prices. And yet the margin rights that are being proposed, or they exist, but the exercise of them would affect all industries. So even if you don't care about the pharmaceutical industry, you very, very much care about these margin rights if you're in any other technology that is at all affected by federally funded research. And so universities and their tech transfer offices are very much alarmed by this proposal. And the real irony of this is that, again, there's data, there's research, and again, it's by the critics of the pharmaceutical industry who that shows that using margin rights specifically with regard to the pharmaceutical industry would have no effect on drug prices whatsoever. So even if you didn't care about the pharmaceutical industry, the industries that are going to be affected are all the others, not the pharmaceutical industry. And so this is the frustration that those of us who look at the actual data experience.
Perhaps I'll ask then for the panel if they have any closing comments or thoughts they'd like to leave the audience with.
I mean, I'll just repeat what I said before. I think, you know, it is so important to be looking at data and be looking at evidence and to be also making sure that the source of your data is reliable. And that really is, I think, the biggest frustration that we've had. Whatever the data shows is, of course, you know, something that should drive policy. But when we start following ideology and putting aside the data and believing things just because we want it to be, rather than actually looking at facts like numbers, which are really easy to verify. It's not hard to look at when a drug was launched and when the generic first came in and do that math. This is basically what the PTO study is doing. And when we do that, we get a very, very different picture of what we've heard for all these years about why we need to cut patent protection. And the last maybe closing point is, as I've said, it's very important, of course, to look at the competition piece and the pricing piece. We all agree with that. But we also can't do that without looking at the impact on innovation. They are, you know, part of the same equation because we can't have one without the other.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just say one of my favorite things to do when I'm looking at a report is to look at the footnotes first. And I think that goes to the point of you need to know where the data is coming from, and you need to know if the sources are reliable. And if there aren't any footnotes and they're giving you a lot of numbers, you have to wonder where that data is coming from.
Professor, I'll give you the final word.
So yeah, I'll just say that we live in a day and age where facts, I think, and I won't say alternative facts, but I just did, that I think we all appreciate now how important facts and data and rigorous objective analysis is, and that we're living in a time where willing something to be true seems to predominate over whether or not it is in fact true. And I think that applies to a variety of things, including pharmaceutical patents.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel for doing an excellent job today and for providing some great information. And again, I want to thank all of you for attending. At the Council for Innovation Promotion, we consider ourselves a resource for folks on the Hill and anyone who's interested in policy. These are complex issues. We hope you'll continue to look to us as a resource, and if we can be helpful going forward, please contact us. And of course, we're also happy to share this information with any of your colleagues on the Hill or in industry or in other organizations that may have an interest in these important issues. Thanks again to the great panel, and have a great day.